This video is brought to you by Ground News. With Germany's federal election now less than a month away, polling shows that the centre-right CDU-CSU party, led by Friedrich Merz, looks pretty likely to win and lead Germany's next government. But what can we expect from Germany's probable next chancellor? In this video, we'll explain by taking a look at the CDU's 2025 election manifesto and what its main policies actually are. Explore which world leaders are winning and which are losing every week with our new podcast, The World Leader Leaderboard. Find it over on the TLDR Podcast YouTube channel or in your favourite podcast app. First up is the economy. The CDU wants to ease the tax burden on low and middle income earners in particular by adjusting the income tax rate, scrapping tax on overtime pay and increasing Germany's commuter allowance, which lets people claim back money on their daily commute. They also want to modernise working hours by changing the maximum working time from daily to weekly and set up a new work and stay agency to handle foreign workers' recruitment, visa, work placement and residency issues. On business, they want to cut bureaucracy by bringing down the rate of corporation tax to 25%, from 29.9% currently, abolishing the Supply Chain Act, which requires companies with over 1,000 employees in Germany to identify and mitigate risks to human rights and the environment in their supply chains, and to, quote, reverse Germany's over-compliance with European law. However, like Germany's other parties, the CDU hasn't stated their official position on Germany's debt brake. If you've been following German politics, you'll know that financing the country's annual budget has been a huge source of disunity among the current centre-left coalition, due to a measure known as the debt brake. This was a rule added to the constitution by CDU Chancellor Angela Merkel in 2009 after the financial crash, which limits the federal government's annual deficit to 0.35% of GDP. It prevents the 16 states or Bundesländer from borrowing at all, so that they maintain balanced budgets. However, as the German economy has stagnated, there have been growing calls to reform the debt brake to allow for more investment. On Monday, a new poll conducted this month by the journal Internationale Politik Quarterly was published, showing that a majority, or 55%, of Germans now support reforming or abolishing the debt brake. This figure has gradually increased over recent months too, with a Forsa poll in November suggesting that 44% of Germans were in favour of reforming it, and another poll from July 2024 suggesting 32% were in favour. Whether this happens will depend on Merz, whose CDU party is split on the issue, but who's recently suggested he might be open to some reform, despite previously being opposed to it. In November, for instance, Merz implied that he could be open to reforms to boost investment, although he was still pretty vague, saying the question is why, for what purpose, what is the result of such a reform? Regardless though, constitutional reforms can only be passed with a 2/3 majority in Parliament, which means that if the AfD and FDP, the two parties staunchly opposed to reforming the debt brake, manage to secure around 25% of the vote between them, as looks possible providing the FDP pass the 5% threshold for parliamentary representation, then that could go some way to blocking these reforms in future. Anyway, moving on to energy now. The CDU under Merz has pledged to ditch the previous government's climate protection policies, with their manifesto calling them ideologically driven. They pledged to end what they call the bureaucratic meddling with people's heating bills by abolishing the Scholz government's heating law, officially the Building Energy Act, which was the subject of intense debate in 2023. For context, the law aimed to phase out oil and gas heating systems in buildings, including eventually in people's homes, which would require them to buy new appliances that met strict environmental standards, for example, heat pumps. This caused a rift within the centre-left coalition and sparked backlash while benefiting parties like the CDU, which was critical of it. The CDU also wants to lower electricity tax and grid fees and increase Germany's energy supply. While the manifesto doesn't explicitly say how they'll do this, it does hint at bringing back nuclear power and prioritising research into 4th and 5th generation nuclear technology, small modular reactors and fusion power plants. However, they're not opposed to sustainable energy either, having pledged to develop all renewables and committed to emissions trading, where governments incentivise firms to reduce their carbon emissions by buying and trading permits for each unit of emissions released. Another interesting policy area is digitalisation. The CDU wants to drive the reindustrialisation of Germany through tech, digitalisation and AI. And to this end, they've pledged to create a new federal digital ministry and spend 3.5% of GDP on research and development by 2030. They also want to invest in aerospace innovation and pursue a quote ambitious space strategy, as well as exempting new companies from regulations while they're in the startup phase. On immigration, the CDU calls for a strict limitation of migration, which they hope to achieve by designating more countries as safe countries of origin, accelerating deportations, suspending family reunification, providing limited bed, bread and soap services for deportees, and transferring asylum seekers to safe third countries, like possibly Rwanda. They will also focus on domestic security through a, quote, 360-degree strategy, which apparently promises harsh action on every form of extremism, violence and terror, specifically through expulsions, removing residence permits, fighting both right-wing and left-wing extremists, punishing anti-Semitic statements and anti-constitutional symbols, i.e. swastikas, closing mosques where hatred is preached, and creating a new customs police force to prevent profits from organised crime going towards things like villas and yachts. On Europe and foreign policy, the CDU is pro-EU, but says Germany's national interests should be advocated more strategically, instead of through, quote, patronising our international partners. They want a stronger EU that's more competitive, and for Germany to have better relations with both France and Poland. The CDU is also opposed to European debt sharing, stating we firmly reject all forms of German liability for the debts of other EU states. On Ukraine, the CDU says it will support Ukraine through diplomatic, financial and humanitarian means and with arms deliveries, and that it will continue to stand by Israel in its legitimate fight against terror. On military issues, the CDU wants to strengthen Germany's defence industry, collaborate more with other European states on sourcing material and equipment, commit to NATO's 2% defence spending target, and, quote, take the lead in building a European missile defence shield. Perhaps more controversial, though, is the CDU's stated aim of reintroducing conscription, which has already happened in the Baltic and Nordic states, but hasn't yet reached Western Europe. Finally, on cultural issues, the CDU says it will introduce mandatory integration agreements and create better opportunities for learning German. The party also wants to prevent what it calls a remotely controlled Islam, i.e. foreign governments influencing mosque associations for German Muslims. In terms of young people, the party wants to introduce a mandatory gap year, which they say will open opportunities and create a sense of unity. However, they also want to repeal the previous government's Self-Determination Act, which allows anyone over the age of 14 to legally change their gender and name on official documents. And lastly, on family issues, the CDU want to improve parental leave and benefits, increase child benefits, and improve the affordability of childcare by making more of it tax deductible. With the election only ramping up, we can only expect tensions in German politics to rise. So if you want to keep following along, the best way to do so is with Ground News, a website and app developed by a former NASA engineer on a mission to give readers an easy, data-driven, objective way to read the news. They pull in stories from all over the world and organise them by story. And every story comes with a quick visual breakdown of the political bias, factuality and ownership of all the sources reporting, all backed by ratings from 3 independent news monitoring organisations. For instance, take this story about Elon Musk's contentious involvement in the German election. Right away, you can see 27 outlets reporting on the Chancellor's recent comments, with 31% leaning left and only 8% leaning right, which means that you could easily have missed the Chancellor's damning remarks altogether if you were only consuming right-leaning media. One of my favourite features of theirs is My News Bias. It's basically a fitness tracker, but for news. It tracks my reading habits over time, my trends in political bias, the specific news outlets I read the most, even the specific topics I gravitate towards. It's been really helpful in minimising my personal blind spots. Now, as an impartial news outlet, we're passionate about informing our viewers about bias and helping them to understand how it affects the media they consume. Ground News is very effective at this, showing you exactly how each side of the political divide covers each story you see online. And best of all, we're currently offering viewers 40% off their Vantage plan, which includes unlimited access to all of their amazing features like their blind spot feed. So go to ground.news/TLDR, click the QR code here on screen, or use the link in the description to subscribe today.